Colombia's FARC rebels announce a unilateral 2-month ceasefire. Could 5 decades of conflict be coming to an end? And Honduras holds presidential primaries, but will the forces that instigated the 2009 coup allow democracy to flourish? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. We begin in Cuba, where the peace talks between FARC guerrillas and the Colombian government appear to receive a major boost with the rebels' announcement of a unilateral ceasefire. Al Jazeera's Teresa Bo has the details from Havana.
A month after the peace process officially started in Oslo, the talks have moved here to Havana, where the FARC made a symbolic announcement on this first day of the negotiations. They declared a unilateral ceasefire and announced that they will halt the attacks against Colombia's security forces and against infrastructure in the country.
We ordered the cessation of all offensive military operations against the public and acts of sabotage against the public or private infrastructure through a period that starts at midnight on November 20th, 2012 until midnight, January 20th, 2013.
From now on, the government and the FARC will start discussing the document that was signed several months ago in secrecy. In that document, there are 5 points that are going to be discussed. Among them is land reform, a demand that the FARC have had for decades, political participation for the FARC, drug trafficking, and how to compensate the thousands of victims of this conflict. The government negotiators are going to stay here in Havana for at least 10 days. Then they will go back to Colombia to update the president on how this peace process is going, and then they will come back for another phase of these negotiations. This is phase 2 of the negotiations, and it's not clear how long it's going to last. The government would like it to last for around 6 months, but the FARC are saying that they're not interested in setting a time limit. If the negotiations in Havana go well, this peace process will then move to phase 3, that is supposedly going to take place in Colombia, where the FARC would lay down their weapons after over 50 years of fighting.
So to discuss the developments of the talks further, we're joined from Bogota by Laura Gill, a columnist for El Tiempo and former consultant to the Organization of American States. And here in the studio, James Jones, a development specialist who's worked extensively in FARC-controlled areas. Jim Jones, first of all, the significance of this unilateral ceasefire.
Well, I think it's significant in the sense that it improves the public perception of the FARC. The FARC several weeks ago asked for a ceasefire, and by that they mean a bilateral ceasefire. And recently Carlos Lozano, a leftist journalist, was in Cuba talking with the FARC. He's probably the only journalist that has done so, and I think he suggested to them while there that they might want to consider a unilateral ceasefire. So I think it's going to improve their image somewhat, but I don't see it as a deal breaker.
Right, but Laura Gill, I mean, the government has announced its intention not only to not have a ceasefire, but perhaps to step up operations. So how will this work practically, do you think?
It will be difficult. I think the government will be forced itself to also declare or perhaps practice a ceasefire without declaring it. But I have to say this is a big, big sigh of relief for all of us here in Colombia.
I mean, how should we interpret all this, especially as we get into the issue of land reform? We heard Teresa Bo there talk about there being 5 points on the agenda. It begins with the most difficult, arguably, Jim Jones, land reform. Does this help create a better atmosphere for what is possibly the most difficult of the topics? Or is it the most difficult of the topics?
Well, it's a topic that the
FARC... Of course.
I'm sorry.
Jim Jones, first of all.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, it's a topic that the FARC have focused on since they emerged a half-century ago. Land reform is probably not the best term for it. Agrarian reform, which includes land reform, but it includes a lot more. It includes government support to farmers. It includes credit to farmers. It includes assistance with finding markets for produce and whatnot. So there's no question that it is very important to the FARC. What I fear is that the interpretation that the government is giving to this and the interpretation that the FARC are giving to it are quite different.
Right.
And
well, perhaps we can talk about those different interpretations. Laura Gill, when you look at how the government interprets this, what do you think they mean?
Let me say something first. Of course, a ceasefire, a declared ceasefire creates a better atmosphere for negotiation. It doesn't matter what they will be negotiating first. The fact is that a ceasefire is what civilians in Colombia were expecting. And this is something very unusual for the FARC. So it is a very, very good sign. In terms of land reform, the first point to be negotiated, there are huge misunderstandings between the government and the FARC about what land reform is. For the government, it would appear that land reform means restitution of lands, something that has already been resolved through the law on restitution of lands. It hasn't been achieved, but it has been legislated on. The FARC are saying this is not enough, that's not land reform. And it goes beyond credits, it goes beyond support for the peasants. For the FARC, that means talking about mining, oil, food security, that means talking about free trade agreements. And I fear, Jim, that's what the government will not agree to talk about.
But is it realistic, though, Jim Jones, to talk about land reform if you don't talk about some of those issues, given it's the mining concessions and the multinational companies and the agribusiness who are, in some ways, well, first of all, they have to, they own much of this land now as a result of the last 50 years. That's a starting point, too.
Right, and I agree with you, Laura, in the sense that there is a very, very different understanding between the two parts with regard to this. One of the things that's interesting to me, the government goes out of its way to say that there will be no change in the so-called development model, okay, for the country. Now, that development model includes foreign investment, heavy foreign investment in extractive industries. And those extractive industries, typically it's oil, it's mining, timber. Those extractive industries are in areas where you have small farmers, and especially indigenous groups and Afro-Colombians. So when the government says they won't change the development model, and then the FARC says that by agrarian reform, they include, as Laura well pointed out, they include the mining concessions and whatnot. So I think this is going to be a sticking point, and this is where I think the interpretation of this first point that the government has and the FARC are very, very different.
Laura Gill, that's the point there. The government negotiator says there will be no discussion of economic models, but if there is no discussion, don't we need a pledge to rein in some of these big corporations and agricultural concerns, and a pledge to, as a result of this neoliberal model they want, not to leave the local communities completely food insecure?
Look, the government says it will negotiate the economic model, it won't negotiate the political model, and it won't negotiate military doctrine. Basically, it won't negotiate anything.
Yeah.
If you say the economic model is capitalism and the political model is democracy, okay, fine, you don't negotiate that. But inside those red lines, democracy and capitalism, within those lines, you have to negotiate.
That's right.
And negotiating the question of mining, negotiating the question of oil exploration and exploitation in Colombia, not only does it have to be discussed at the table, it has to be discussed with the rest of the citizens here, with society here.
Yes, it does.
And the negotiating table has to find a voice for those Afro-Colombian communities, for those indigenous communities where those development economic projects are.
So then you have to ask the question, has FARC changed its philosophical model in some way? Is it accepting some of the government's parameters with a view to political integration and fighting for some of these issues within the political system, along with other civil society actors? Has it changed its philosophy, do you think, Jim Jones?
I don't think the FARC
has already.
Jim Jones, quickly first.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think that the FARC have really basically changed their philosophy. But when they start negotiating, they're going to bring in these other issues. And there's another point here that bears mention, and that is the role of civil society. The FARC early on have argued that they want civil society to participate, and when they say that, they mean civil society participating at the table in Havana. Now, how one does that that's the challenge.
Larigal, very quickly then, last word. Do you see that FARC has changed? Are they looking for political recognition and then fighting for some of these issues within the political system as is in Colombia?
Look, I think it has already changed a little bit. If you look at the agenda calls for legal security for private property for the peasant. That's already a change. The FARC talking about private property. I hope that at the table we will see more changes, but we will see more changes on both sides because the country needs lots of reforms. And those reforms need not be discussed with the FARC, but also with the rest of the country.
Now to Honduras, where the three main political parties have been choosing their candidates for next year's presidential election. The country's been ravaged by violence since President Manuel Zelaya was deposed in a military-backed coup in 2009. Honduras has the highest murder rate in the world, 4 times that of Mexico. The run-up to the presidential primaries has seen yet more violence. Several opposition candidates are amongst the dead and the targeted. In addition, since the coup, 23 journalists have lost their lives, with regular attacks on the rural poor, opposition groups and indigenous communities. The most significant result in the primaries was the election of Xiomara Castro, the wife of the deposed president, as the presidential candidate for the Liberty and Refoundation, or Libre party. The party was formed after the coup as an attempt to break up the traditional two-party system. She will face Mauricio Villeda for the Liberal Party, and it seems Juan Orlando Hernandez, who appears set to represent the governing National Party in next year's election. So, will the elections in Honduras be free and fair? To discuss this, we're joined by Dana Frank. She's a historian of Honduras who teaches at the University of California, Santa Cruz. In New York, Pamela Spies, a lawyer at the Center for Constitutional Right. She represents the parents of Isa Murillo, a 19-year-old demonstrator who was shot and killed in the aftermath of the Honduras coup in 2009. First of all, Professor Frank, it's interesting. I just reeled off a number of results, although as we speak we've just been told, there's the possibility that these may be provisional results. There's some confusion right now, isn't there?
Well, there was a press conference. It sounds like what they decided, that the president announced there was going to be a recount all the way from the beginning. But so one thing we do know, though, is that Xiomara de Castro Zelaya is the candidate of Libre, the new opposition
just how
party.
significant is that?
Well, this is absolutely, and I'm speaking here as a historian of Honduras, this is absolutely unprecedented in Honduran history. It looks like she got at least a quarter of all the votes that were cast yesterday. There has never been an opposition party in Honduras that got more than 3 or 4%. And this also unites the labor movement, a big part of one of the traditional parties, the social movements, all kinds of movements that rose up to defend the constitutional order after the coup. It's a tremendous threat to the entrenched elites and their lockdown on power.
I mean, does it really matter who is the actual final candidate of the National Liberal Party?
Well, both of these parties are of the ruling elites. They're all members of the oligarchy. They're gradations of ultra-right wing. So you can have your different gradations of ultra-right wing. They're all terrifying. They're all implicit in the coup. They're all part of this ruling elite that doesn't want to give up power.
So what's the policy platform then of the Libre Party then?
Well, they certainly want to deal with social justice in the country. They would restore some kind of democratic process to begin with. They do talk about redistribution of wealth. They talk about cleaning up the police. They talk about land reform. One of the biggest issues is dealing with agrarian reform, particularly in the Awan Valley, ending this tremendous war against the Honduran people. Just at the basic level, ending this war by state security forces that's been going on against against the Honduran people.
Well, let's go into some of that context as we bring Pamela Spies in a moment. As we mentioned, Honduras does have the highest murder rate in the world. There are 92 murders per 100,000 people in the nation. That comes to 18 violent deaths every day. The US says it's currently withholding tens of millions in aid for Honduras, specifically for units directly controlled by the country's police chief. There are allegations he has links to death squads. But the death of a 15-year-old in May has raised further questions. Eber Llanes was shot after driving through a military checkpoint by Honduran soldiers trained and equipped by the US. There does remain a high level of cooperation between the US and Honduran security forces. Reports say there's been a large increase in the US military presence in the country at several bases. And in May, Honduran police and agents from America's Drug Enforcement Administration, using US State Department helicopters, were involved in an operation that killed 4 people, including 2 pregnant women, whom locals say they had nothing to do with drug smuggling. That's some of the context. Pamela, there's a lot to unpick. There's the violence, there's the US presence, there are the landowners and their paramilitaries, the attacks against trade unions, labor activists, and so forth. First of all, though, Pamela, put this in the context of this election. The OAS, the Organization of American States, called the election normal. But in this context, I'm not entirely sure what normal means. But I mean, are these primaries being held without intimidation and killing?
Well, I think you made the point that normal in Honduras is there's a different standard used by the OAS since the coup. We saw, the same types of threats and violence around the elections in November of 2009 after the coup, and it's continued and expanded. And what we're seeing is either killings of candidates or would-be candidates. We're seeing threats and attacks. It's not an atmosphere in which you can legitimately, realistically expect to have free and fair elections.
And we should underscore that it wasn't just the primary elections that were underway. There were various local elections going on as well. I mean, were people able to campaign? Did the press adequately represent the different parties and candidates?
For the most part, the answer is no. The press has been under attack since the coup of 2009. Journalists are constantly being threatened and harassed and killed, as you mentioned. 23 journalists since the coup have been killed. And, that was one of the main criticisms leveled by the UN and the Organization of American States and even the Carter Center in 2009, which is why they chose not to send election observers, because they said in that climate there was no way to hold free and fair elections. And so you have all of that plus this time around.
So beyond the election context, I mean, you've just filed a case at the International Criminal Court on behalf of your organization and another organization. Perhaps can you very briefly sketch out what that case is?
Well, we basically submitted a filing to the International Criminal Court prosecutor asking that she open an official investigation into the responsibility of the post-coup leaders and as well as the high-ranking leaders who are currently in power for their role and responsibility in the commission of crimes against humanity, which, as you know, are widespread and systematic, very serious human rights offenses like killings and enforced disappearances and torture. And so we asked the prosecutor to begin an official investigation. We know they've been looking at it preliminarily, but we wanted to really underscore the point that these attacks have not stopped since the coup. They've expanded, and they've expanded into a new administration. Even though there were the elections in November of 2009, these attacks and this political persecution has continued under the new administration. The interests behind the coup have not changed.
Well, I was about to ask Professor Frank, I mean, is there a clear connection, though, between these killings and the sort of names we see pop up in these elections and their backers, the business interests in the country?
Well, how do we establish that? We certainly know that there's almost complete impunity in this country. So you can kill anybody you want and nothing's going to happen to you. How do you actually establish who is the intellectual authors of these assassinations? It's hard to do. We do know that these are the people that in fact backed the coup at the time and that they're benefiting from it. And we also know some things, for example, that the National Chief of Police, as you said, Juan Carlos Bonilla, has been charged with death squad killings in the early 2000s. And one of the Libre candidates for mayor of Tegucigalpa, Maria Luisa Borjas, was the person who wrote that report when she was a police inspector, and that police tried to kidnap her, assault her last week. We know that the national spokesman for the police, Hector Ivan Mejia, was guilty of was in charge of the police of San Pedro Sula when the opposition demonstration was tear gassed and an opposition radio station was invaded 2 years ago on Independence Day, and he's still the national spokesman for the police even though he's under arrest charges. What's going on that neither of these men have been suspended, and they're the ones that are supposed to be establishing the rule of law in this country during the electoral process, obviously along with the military?
As far as the backers are concerned, though, we always hear the name Miguel Facusé come up, though. He recently got a World Bank loan. He's thought of internationally as a pillar of commercial activity, and yet there are accusations against him and his paramilitaries.
Yeah, Miguel Facusé is described by the U.S. Embassy itself as the most richest and most powerful man in the country. His nephew was president of Honduras about three administrations back, and he's the one whose security guards have allegedly killed 40 or 50 campesinos in the Awan Valley in cooperation with other state security forces. Why has Miguel Facusé not been prosecuted? These are these ruling families that are all interlocked. If you look at the ruling families and the four candidates that for the ruling party and the other traditional party, they're all of these 13 families, including Miguel Facusé, and you can actually do little charts and trace how they're all connected and how they have interlocking ownership of the economic resources of Honduras.
Pamela, are these the sort of allegations and the sort of background that are contained then in your case to the ICC?
That's correct. What we did was we provided a documentation of over 100 killings that have taken place just in the last 2 years. And we really focused on the attacks on campesinos, on the farmers and the farmer cooperatives in Bajo Aguan, which is an area which is largely controlled by Miguel Facusé. He is the purported owner of thousands of hectares of property there that are a subject of controversy. And a court recently found that actually the titles were rightfully belonged to the 3 campesino cooperatives. So the submission focuses quite a bit on the situation there. As Professor Frank said, there have been a number of killings, and many of them have been. There's evidence that Facusé's guards are linked to those killings in consultation and coordination with state security forces.
All right, so all this time...
and there have been a number of forced transfers.
All this time, and that's all we should get on to, Professor Frank, the U.S. says, the standard line in the New York Times is that the U.S. is withholding military aid, or aid rather. And yet, clearly they have an enormous presence in Honduras, and there is a great deal of aid going into help security forces, and lots of aid that we don't really know about as well.
Of course, tracking it is part of
Right.
the whole question of transparency for our own government. There is at least $50 or $56 million allegedly, supposedly flowing into Honduras under different channels, including the Central American Regional Security Initiative, because of congressional pressure, I would underscore. Members of Congress, especially Senator Patrick Leahy and many other forces in Congress, have been putting pressure on the State Department about that funding. So we know from the New York Times that at least $50 million in aid, police and military aid, and maybe even economic aid has been withheld from Honduras.
But there's still a great deal of other money going.
There's still, that's maybe half of all the money, because there's the humanitarian economic aid that is still flowing. The problem here is that the Honduran people don't even know this is happening. Ambassador Kubisky last Tuesday in a speech about the elections, I would see this as a deliberate act of misinformation, said it's not true that the money has been cut to the drug war. Well, the money has been suspended, not cut. Why is she not informing the Honduran people that the U.S. position is that this money is being suspended, and also because of the allegations of death squad activity by the National Chief of Police? So it's one thing, the State Department and the Embassy are sort of acting like this isn't happening because they're kicking and screaming all the way, because Congress is putting, and the public is putting tremendous pressure on the State Department to say, what is going on that we're supporting this corrupt regime, which has drug traffickers in it from top to bottom.
All right, well, I think you raised a very interesting question. So what we'll do is we're going to have an extra few minutes on our web edition of the program, because, I mean, certainly the drug war is often used as a reason for U.S. presence, particularly in Honduras. But that's it for our broadcast edition of Inside Story from Washington, D.C. for now. And we still have Pamela Spies with us from New York and Professor Dana Frank here in the studio. We were just getting on to the U.S.'s role then in the country, Professor Frank. And I mean, you mentioned actually, you said, well, you know, much of the population doesn't even know that the U.S. is involved. But we increasingly know some of the U.S.'s involvement, particularly due to a few particular cases which have shown incredible violence, which the U.S. has, it's later turned out there's been U.S. involvement. One is what happened at that checkpoint in May. Perhaps you can just run through that very quickly.
Well, in May, military that were engaged in policing, which itself is an extremely controversial issue. And in fact, Leon Panetta from the United States just gave a speech in Uruguay saying the U.S. does not support military going into policing. And yet these are U.S.-funded military, U.S.-vetted military that were doing at a police checkpoint. And this boy who had, it turns out, had, thanks to Associated Press, we know that this boy had never even been out alone in the city at night. And he took the family's motorcycle and he went out and he drove through a checkpoint when they told him to stop. And they chased him down in an alley and shot him up. And it's really a terrifying example.
So what's the U.S. connection to that?
The U.S. connection to that is that it turns out, thanks to AP, that those soldiers were U.S. vetted, which means they were approved, that they were not people had previously committed human rights abuses, that they were proved as clean, that these were the good guys, that the colonel then ordered a cover-up of the operation and the weapons switch, that he was trained at WINSEC, which used to be called the School of Americas, and at the Naval Postgraduate School. The officer who ordered the killing was also trained in the United States. The equipment was donated to the United States. So this is U.S. direct funding for a military that is killing this citizen, this 14-year-old boy, in this incredibly brutal manner while engaging in policing, which is against the Honduran Constitution. It's only supposed to be an emergency.
Pamela Spies, I mean, as a result of that case, which was reported, have there been major questions asked about the so-called vetting procedure, about who is being trained, about what's happening to all this taxpayer money in Honduras?
Oh, well, there have been questions asked by civil society, for sure, and a lot of pressure along the way even before then, because there have been similar incidents where we find out later that either U.S. trained soldiers or police were involved, or in the incident earlier in May in Awas, that there were actually U.S. DEA agents involved.
Well, perhaps you can quickly explain that. We did actually a show on that on Inside Story, but very briefly then, perhaps you can, in a nutshell, explain what happened there and what questions remain to be asked there.
Sure. Well, a combination of U.S. and Honduran drug enforcement agents were in a U.S. helicopter and in Awas and flying over a river, and they opened fire on a boat of people who, it turns out, were completely unarmed, had nothing to do with drugs, and several were killed. And you know, there are a lot of questions and concerns about what the DEA was doing, the level of their involvement, you know, and what's really going on in these situations.
Right.
And it's hard to get answers about the level of investigation, but there are a lot of organizations, you know, calling for more scrutiny.
Well, this is why it's so interesting, Professor Frank. I mean, we see then the U.S. militaries in Honduras. We see the DEAs in Honduras. We see State Department helicopters being used. There were recent reports about U.S. border agents manning checkpoints. I mean, how many U.S. agencies are actually being deployed?
Well, wouldn't we like to know? We know that maybe sometimes 600 up to 1,000 soldiers are based at Sotocano Air Force Base. The DA does not disclose how many of these advisors or agents are
there other bases there around?
There are at least 3 of these so-called forward operating bases of the DEA. So you've got U.S. advisors to the DEA people. You've got U.S. direct military, and then you've got people that are also doing training of including the Air Force, and then you also have U.S.-funded Honduran military, and that gets into the tens of thousands. And also, U.S. is now increasing its own presence at Sotocano Air Force Base, and they're now making the barracks at Sotocano Air Force Base permanent and spending $25 million on that for the first time since 1954, when it's supposed to be temporary. What is going on here for the U.S. military?
So the U.S. would presumably say, look, this is because Honduras is a major drugs transshipment point. This is all part of the war on drugs. Can everything be explained away in that manner, do you think?
Well, first of all, as I think you know, that throughout Latin America, and more Latin American leaders, including the presidents of Guatemala and Colombia, have called for an end to the militarized war on drugs. So who are we doing this in the name of if these Latin Americans are increasingly questioning this whole model where you see some drugs and then they pop up somewhere else? And what is going on there where you end up in the process of that waging a war on the people of Honduras and other parts of Latin America?
And you suggested that the military, who are the U.S.'s allies themselves, have been...
Well, it's not just the military. In fact, the U.S. has suspended radar cooperation in Honduras since July because the Honduran military not only violated some protocol in shooting down 2 planes, but the U.S. is concerned that intelligence is being shared with the Honduran military, which is an admission that the Honduran military are either corrupt, incompetent, or drug traffickers, or all three. And you can read that. That was in the New York Times about 3 weeks ago. But it's also, we're supposedly helping the Honduran government fight the drug traffickers. The Honduran government is partially the drug traffickers. There are top-level prosecutors, there are judges, there are Congress members and members of the executive branch that are part of organized crime. And members of the government themselves have said that there are these drug Congress members, drug judges. So we're supposedly helping them with increasing their prosecutorial capacity when the prosecutors themselves are in bed with an organized crime.
So is it fair then to just ask whether this is simply because of Honduras' geostrategic importance?
Well, okay, there's the $64,000 question. Sotocano Air Force Base is the only large Air Force base between the United States and Latin America, and Ecuador kicked the United States out of the base in Ecuador. So some of it is just military, but then why do we have this military presence there? Who is, in fact, are we in war with if the drug war is really about U.S. consumption of drugs? Is it about the increasing economic presence of China? But it's also about pushing back against all the center-left and left governments of Bolivia, Venezuela, and Ecuador.
Well, we only have a couple of minutes left, Pamela Spees. So in this context, then, we expect an election to take place, in free and fair circumstances next year. And you have to wonder, actually, how the U.S. is looking at Xiomara Castro and her policy platform in this context as well.
Well, right. Well, the policy platform of the Libre Party is something that really grew out of the resistance after the coup. And as you have reported, the U.S. was playing a leading role in normalizing relations with Honduras after the coup and after the controversial elections. So I think the same issue, we'll be revisiting the same issues. They'll be front and center in these next elections, and U.S. policy will be under the microscope.
Final thought, Dana Frank, the U.S. is, how do you think the U.S. is looking at Castro?
Well, I do want to underscore what human rights leaders and activists in Honduras are saying, which is they're terrified that the Libre candidates are not going to live for that election a year from now. That because at least 5 Libre local candidates have been assassinated in the past year, including 2 mayoral candidates 2 weeks ago. So I think the bottom line is the U.S. going to condemn this repression of the opposition? Is the U.S. actually going to, would they even accept Xiomara Castro, or would they just allow another coup to go forward? When is the U.S. going to denounce the systematic repression of the opposition, which they still haven't? They'll talk about individual, they'll talk about LGBT killings, they'll talk about journalists, but they will never denounce the systematic repression of the opposition. I think the most important thing is that the Libre candidates, this is an unprecedented moment in Honduran history, will they live to even be there for the election a year from now?
Professor Dana Frank, thank you. Pamela Spees, thank you very much. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.